Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Deacon Edge at Federation Square for this first offering of the Archbishop's Conversations for 2021. We begin with an acknowledgement of country. Recognizing that the one Creator God made all peoples and nations from one common ancestor, we acknowledge the original custodians of the land upon which we meet, the people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, knowing that the work of reconciliation requires our ongoing commitment. My name is Patrick. I am the assistant curate at the parish of Banyule, which comprises the suburbs of Heidelberg, Rosanna, and Watsonia, and I am the MC for today. Well, today's topic of conversation, COVID economics, where next? Archbishop Philip Freyr is joined today by Saul Eslake and Kasy Chambers. Saul Eslake is an independent economist, commentator, and speaker with the Australia Institute. He is the Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Tasmania, as well as an associate of Llewellyn Consulting, a London-based independent economics advisory. Saul worked as an economist at stockbroking firms, insurance companies, the federal government, investment banks, the Grattan Institute, and was the chief economist of ANZ from 1995 to 2009. Saul holds a first-class honours degree in economics from the University of Tasmania. And he currently lives in Tasmania with his wife Linda, and they have 2 children. Kasy Chambers currently is the CEO of Anglicare Australia. Some of her past positions include Manager Communications and Government Relations at Uniting Care Australia, Assistant Secretary in the Australian Government Department of Family, Community Services and Indigenous Affairs, and Executive Officer of the Resource Unit for Children with Special Needs in Western Australia. Kasy holds an honours degree in psychology, a master's in business administration, and the graduate diploma in ethics. She enjoys the outdoors, especially canoeing, walking, and camping. The conversation today is moderated by the Anglican Archbishop of Melbourne, Philip Freier. Previously, he has been the primate of the Anglican Church of Australia, the bishop of the Northern Territory, as well as the rector of various churches in the Diocese of Brisbane. Before entering Holy Orders, Archbishop Philip worked as a teacher at Thursday Island, Coanyama, and Yarrabah, all in far northern Queensland. He has a Doctor of Philosophy, a Master of Educational Studies, a Bachelor of Divinity, a Diploma in Education, and the Bachelor of Applied Science. He is married to Joy, and they have 2 children and 3 grandchildren. Thank you, Archbishop.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you everyone for attending. It's a great pleasure after about an 18-month hiatus to be able to join here, so thanks for your courage and getting out and observing all the things that can make this a safe event. Well, it probably is going to be redundant, but I'll probably say the word. It's been an exceptional year last year. I'll get that out of the road first. And we've had a lot of things happen, and we've all been through many things, and probably for some of us had a lot of time to reflect and think about things. And we're going to particularly focus today on some of the economic response we've made as a nation to the situations we've encountered, and why that might be important. It's interesting, the whole approach in the whole long tradition of Judeo-Christian faith has maybe a mixed relationship with money. And it's sometimes seen at a personal level to be something that diverts people from the proper attention to God and to each other. But at a corporate level, and we can explore this a bit better, there's often seen the importance of life being brought back into an equilibrium where there isn't too much disparity between wealth and poverty. So I just wanted to open up asking Kasy, as far as she has seen, what has been the impact of all of the measures? And there have been many. There's been protection for renters, there's been protection for people with mortgages, there's been interventions by, in various degrees by local governments, state governments, and most importantly the federal government. Of those interventions and put all together, what's been the impact of those on some of the most vulnerable people and families in Australia?
Well, I was going to start there, and it's been an unusual year for most of us. Most of us, I've certainly been very engaged in thinking, I can't travel. But when I get outside of that, it's been a remarkable year for people who rely on income support for their well-being. So, in case anyone didn't know, the country actually doubled what's now called job seeker during this time, and it brought it to the poverty line. Just on the poverty line for the first time since 1994 or so. So this was a really important thing. And what we saw for people was we talked to people constantly who had bought a fridge. They hadn't had access to a fridge before. It meant that they could save money and buy fresh food and buy it in larger amounts. We talked to people who said things like, I've bought my 12-year-old daughter a birthday present for the first time in her life. We spoke to people who are starting to pay down debts and do some normal things and get actually back on a ladder of hope that life might be normal. I was just mentioning to somebody as we were standing around at the start, that's had a bit of an odd effect now that that's being turned back, because I'm starting to hear from people who were saying something along the lines of, before this happened, we thought it was just the way it is, that there are poor and that there are rich, and that's just the way it was. We can now see that the government can find housing for people, it can put people in hotels, and it can double job seeker. Taking that away now tells us what the government, and when people say government, they, we vote that government in, and we are that government, and they are of us. But people are now saying, we now know what the government think of us because they've halved that now, and because, we are back to where we were. And it's been a remarkable year. It's been like a social experiment in many ways, to see that rate doubled. But now going back to where it was is going to be particularly harsh, I think.
Well, I think we'll return to some of those themes as we go through. But Saul, if I could turn to you, just perhaps paint the picture of how we ended up with the kind of interventions we had and what they were intended to do, and to the extent you can summarise it, how effective you think they've been in meeting those goals.
Well, I think the first point I'd make, and it plays to some of what Kasy was saying, is that while we've been through what most people regard as the most severe recession Australia has had since the Great Depression, this experience has, from an economic perspective, been very different from every other recession we've had, including the Great Depression, in the sense that it was brought on by government, deliberately and consciously, for a good reason, namely to prevent something that could have been even worse, namely the uncontrolled spread of what is a potentially fatal disease for many people. So I'm not criticising governments for doing what they did. The recession that followed was a side effect rather than the intention. But I think because this recession and the economic pain which it could have caused was the result of deliberate conscious actions, governments have felt almost a moral responsibility which they haven't felt in previous recessions, that have almost always been brought on by interest rates being too high for too long and or some kind of financial crisis here or abroad. Governments have felt a moral responsibility to do as much as they possibly can to ameliorate the consequences of the decisions which they have made in the name of public health. And I think that's why governments have been prepared to do so many more things, as Kasy outlined, than they would normally have done during a recession. I mean, you could, if you were cynical, say that so that they don't get the blame for it at the next election, or you could say they did it out of genuine reflection on their part that they had caused a lot of pain and it was incumbent on them to ameliorate it as much as possible. So, as Kasy said, there's been a heightened awareness and in many quarters appreciation of what governments can do, for better or for worse. History tells us that when governments acquire new powers, including of things like mass surveillance, they don't let them go. And I do worry that, for example, all the ways that governments have now found of monitoring who does what, where, when and with whom will be a permanent part of life, and that frightens me. But we've also learned that governments can do things that are good and that can help change the situations that people find themselves in through no fault of their own. Governments have been able to finance all the things that they've done because, coincidentally, interest rates have been extraordinarily low. And that, of course, was the result of 20 years of very low inflation combined with the aftermath of the global financial crisis. So that the least of the things that governments have to worry about now and for the foreseeable future is servicing the debt that they've accumulated whilst running these big budget deficits. Because interest rates are so low, governments will be spending a smaller proportion of their revenue and of our national income on interest than they did even 5 years ago when debt was a lot lower than it is today, but interest rates were a fair bit higher. So that's not a worry. But as we return to normal, if people or their governments want governments to continue doing some of the things that they've been doing for the past year, and or at the levels at which they've been doing them, then they're going to have to figure out how we have to pay for that. Because, in short, governments have been spending 10 percentage points of our national income more than what they've been collecting in taxes. And while that's not a problem at the moment, we can't go on doing it forever. So if people do want governments to continue doing some of the things, and obviously they're not going to continue JobKeeper indefinitely, but if people want governments to continue doing many of the things that they've started to do during the pandemic, then we'll also have to have a conversation about how we pay for that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you've raised the question of the moral choices, and often we've framed economic debates in Australia with a moral kind of discourse underneath it. We've sort of said that politicians have certainly said that, the analogy to a prudently run household was the analogy that we should operate on in national economics. There was a moral failure if you built up debt and you expended a generation that isn't yet even in the workforce to pay it off. That there was sort of something morally wrong with making life a bit too easy for the poor because that would take some of their incentive away. It's interesting that we've become accustomed to a lot of moral language around these matters, many of which have been overturned by the decisions that have been made. But Kasy, I just wanted to come back to you because you said earlier that there is this, people who've experienced that governments can do more to even lift their life to the poverty line, which doesn't sound like, for most of us here, a very high level. But when governments decide to tune that back, that's looking more like, for those people who are telling you that, they're conscious others are making moral choices about them and their worthiness. Would you go that far?
Yeah, definitely. I've been very disappointed in during this time, and I was disappointed during the global financial crisis too, in that times of crisis seem like a really good time to be innovative, to throw things out, to look at how we see things and see whether this is the real way to see things, see if there are other ways, see if we can be brave, all those kind of things. And I do think that we should be having a conversation about the explicit social contract, because we don't seem to have that very often. So we get these mini messages about whether debt is good or bad, or whether we should be offering a carrot to poor people or bashing them with a stick from behind, and those kind of conversations. But I think the broader one about the social contract would be a good one to have at this time. And the other thing that I think we often forget and this is a bit of a soapbox of mine, is we talk about poverty as a wicked problem or something that has to be there. Whereas, lots of modelling that even we can do at Anglicare Australia shows us that there is lots of money around. And I think the other thing we need to think about is broadening, certainly our thoughts at Anglicare, we think about a lot about income, but thinking about wealth. And intergenerational wealth, and how we move wealth between generations, how we move wealth between, how we allow for social mobility, how basically we allow people to have hope that things might be different and that they can follow a plan that they might want to have in what they want to do in their lives.
Yeah, well, we'll come to some of those themes as well, I think. But I just wanted to come back to Saul and ask, how far do you think the household analogy of a prudently run household ever stacked up? Because I think Margaret Thatcher might have been famously one of the ones who popularised that view, and it's been treated pretty frequently by treasurers in this country.
Well, she did, and so did Ronald Reagan at roughly the same time. And I mean, to be fair to them in the first instance, politicians and others who are trying to explain complex concepts to people who have no background in them, understandably resort to simplifications. In the same way, I sort of hesitate to refer to scripture in the presence of an archbishop, but Jesus told parables to explain concepts that might not have been immediately obvious. So you can perhaps think about the analogies between household and government budgets as a kind of parable, and they have some value, but they're also limited, perhaps in a way that the scriptural parables weren't. I mean, the key difference is that households regard it as normal and desirable to pay off the debt they accumulate at some point of their lifetime, usually to buy a home, before they die, because we don't want to leave debts to our children. If we have the capacity to, and not all of us do, but if we have the capacity to, we would prefer to leave our children assets. Sometimes, as an aside, and we might come back to this, I think that gets taken too far, that some people think they have an unlimited right to leave assets to their children without sharing any of it via estate duties or anything. And most rich countries don't share Australia's governing philosophy on that particular point of view. But by and large, people want to leave their children, if they can, assets, not debt. But neither governments nor companies die. So there's nothing in principle wrong with governments having debt. There's nothing wrong in principle with governments saying that when they build assets that are going to benefit future generations as well as the present one, that future generations shouldn't contribute something to the cost of creating those assets by servicing debt and eventually at some point, for example, paying it off. In the same way that companies don't feel that they have to have zero debt on their balance sheet, but that they will invest on behalf of current generations of shareholders, and future generations of shareholders will pay interest on that debt and hopefully will reap greater profits from the investments that that debt has financed. And, historically, there's not been a day since 1776 when the United States federal government hasn't had some debt outstanding. There hasn't been a day since 1693 when the British or UK government hasn't had some debt outstanding. And I only say 1693 because that's when the Bank of England was founded and started keeping figures on it. Probably you'd go back to at least the time of Edward I, in 1300 and something, when the UK government hasn't had some debt. We in Australia are actually a bit unusual in that there was a brief period in the early 2000s when the Commonwealth government, under Howard and Costello, had paid off, well, actually hadn't paid off all its debt, but had accumulated more cash in the Reserve Bank and the Future Fund than they had gross debt outstanding. That was unusual. Large as the debt which the Australian government now has as a result of the deficits it's run during COVID, as a proportion of our national income, it is still less than the debt which the federal government had in every year from Federation until about 1958. And so, as I said before, on the list of things that government should be worrying about purely in the economic sphere, debt is sort of somewhere down around number 34.
So it sounds like, in a way, we've had, like in many other aspects of this COVID year, we've had something of a paradigm shift. We possibly have flipped into a new normal that may be one about the narrative about balanced budgets, aiming for surpluses, the wickedness of leaving debt for a future generation, that might recede out of our political narrative, who can say, but it sounds like it's going to be pretty hard running those lines in the present reality. So that brings us back to the choices we're making, and I'd be really interested from both of your perspectives, and I'll ask Kasy first, about the choices we've made. You know, you've mentioned a few times already about choice and what's possible, but we've got eye-watering and staggering numbers. How would you deploy those resources? Any differently to what they've been spent on?
And resources as in the monetary resources?
Yeah, the financial resources.
Yeah. I think it would be impossible for me to look anyone in the eye who's on the dole and say that I'm taking it back to the previous level. So for me, I'd have to look at that. I do think there's a lot of money which does not do what it is named to do. So if we look at housing is a huge issue for people on low incomes. We have a private rental market that is set up as the policy answer to low and middle income housing. It is financed in a way that assists the landlords and the owners to accumulate wealth. It is not financed in a way that assists people to have low-cost housing. When I say it's finance, I don't mean the bank interest. I mean the vast amount of public money that goes into negative gearing, for example, but also into things like capital gains tax relief on principal residence and things. When we model that, we can see that there's around about, depending on who you get to model it, but certainly about $82 billion a year in that and various other housing costs. That does not flow through to the user of that. And we also see that that's quite insecure. Our private rental housing is very much set up in a way that favours the landlord. And I don't want to set that up as a sort of dichotomy. It seems to me that it's set up from a time when housing in Australia, your housing journey was with mum and dad, a year somewhere in a share house that could be a bit rough, and that was part of a rites of passage, and then into your marital or adult home. That's not the case for many people any longer. More people live in rental housing for longer. So we do need to really be looking at that, at its cost, but also at its security. Unless we have a secure home for as long as we want it to be to grow up in, there are huge difficulties for children in accessing their education. We might think of education as free, but if you haven't got a warm room to do your homework in, or if you are moving more often than you would choose, which we know most private renters do, that becomes difficult in that respect. I do think there are some choices to make, and when I think about intergenerationally, when I think about what people who are young today will look back and think of as this COVID thing, we do have to talk about the environment. We do have to talk about what we're leaving young people there. But when we look at some of the things like the unemployment that's coming through and the insecure work, that is going to be affecting young people very much more in whether that's the unemployment, whether it's the amount of work that they get, the underemployment. And the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence, their youth employment monitor, picks up on that and unpicks that unemployment rate. And I think we need to have some conversations as a country about that as well, that we can't just talk about unemployment. We need to think about it in a gendered way. We need to think about it in an age way. We need to think about what it means for Indigenous people, and we need to think about how that factors across the suburbs, the outer suburbs, how public transport interacts. So there's a lot of conversations that we could be having as a country that this seemed like a great excuse to have, that we now seem to be papering over a little bit and trying to get back to the old normal. And it'd be great to keep thinking about what a new normal could look like.
Yeah, well, I think that the period last year really highlighted to us that we had, we'd largely lost a lot of our manufacturing capacities, or even things you might take for granted, personal protective equipment and face masks and those kinds of things. If they're seen to, we had become reliant on an international supply chain along with many other things, and this whole question about community infrastructure. Presumably there are choices are made about investment there, but we have used some models, presumably for thought-through reasons of keeping money moving and prospering things. But Saul, what do you think? Have we, in our priorities, have we spent the money as wisely as we might?
Well, no, in a word. And let me give you a couple of different examples just to broaden the conversation. We're going to be spending, I think, at least $50 billion over the next 10 years building submarines and another 30 billion or so building frigates in Adelaide, that if we really needed them, we could have bought for less than half the price by importing them. Right? Now, you can argue whether we need the submarines or frigates in the first place. We probably do need some of them, because much as we might wish it otherwise, we as a nation do face some external threats and we need the capacity to defend ourselves. So I'm not one of these people who says we shouldn't spend any money on defence. But on the other hand, I'm far from persuaded that it's sensible to spend twice as much as we could on those defence merely to create jobs in Adelaide. Right? And I'd say that if we were sitting here in Adelaide rather than Melbourne, that defence policy shouldn't be used to build inefficiencies into an economy. And so, one of the ways of generating more money for other more worthwhile projects, as Kasy has outlined, would be to spend money that we choose to spend less wastefully than we do spend it. That said, to go back to something I said before, if we want governments to continue spending in some of the ways that they have been temporarily during the pandemic, then we need to have a separate conversation about how we generate that money through either increased or different forms of taxation. And maybe we'll get onto that. It doesn't particularly trouble me, as you said, we've lost some of our manufacturing capacity. I mean, yes, that's true, but although it's almost sacrilegious to say it, the reality is that we're not particularly good at manufacturing in Australia. We never have been, and the only times we've ever had a relatively large manufacturing sector have been when we forced Australians to pay unnecessarily high prices for what were badly made goods, more often than not, through tariff protection. And during that era, when we had very high tariff walls, so that we could pat ourselves on the back and say, hey, look, we really are a manufacturing nation. We went from having the highest living standards in the world to ranking about 22nd by the time the light went on and it dawned on us that that was actually not sensible. And, the practical reality is that to be good at manufacturing in today's world, you need to have scale. That is, you need to be able to produce a lot of stuff, so that a lot of widgets, so that the fixed costs associated with running a manufacturing plant are per widget small. There are two ways to get scale. You can have a big domestic market, like America, Japan, continental Europe as the European Union, China have. Or if you don't, you can get scale through exporting, which is what Korea, Taiwan, Japan when it was a smaller economy, Switzerland, Sweden, countries like that are able to do. And they're able to do it because they're actually very close to big markets. Because transport technology hasn't changed much in the last 60 years. Planes don't fly any faster than they did. Ships are a bit bigger, but they don't go a lot faster usually than they used to. So exporting manufacturing goods has a transport element to it that technology has not yet been able to overcome. And that means that successful small nations that are successful at manufacturing have this observable habit of being next door to big ones, and we're not. Right? So what we're good at, we're good at mining because the one creator has endowed this continent with an extraordinary amount of minerals. We have a mining sector that represents 10% of our economy. Yeah? Almost every other economy with our standard of living, mining represents 2% or less. The good Lord also endowed this country with the capacity to grow a lot of food and fibre, which most other advanced economies don't have. Agriculture is about 4% of our economy, compared with less than 2% of most other Western economies. So we have two sectors that are about 15%, that collectively represent about 3% of others. In every rich country, people want to spend between about 2/3 and 3/4 of their income on services. Services are almost inherently non-tradable. You can't export haircuts. Yeah, some tourism, education, you can trade a bit. But for example, most people don't want to go overseas for primary and secondary school. So most services can't be traded. That means that if you want, unlike Stalin, an economy that produces things that people actually want to buy, about 2/3 to 3/4 of any rich economy is going to be services, which ours is. So if you're going to have an economy that is 15% mining and agriculture, and you're going to have an economy that's between 2/3 and 3/4 services because that's what people want to spend their money on, then something else has to be smaller because politicians really find this hard to understand. The sum of the different sectors of the economy can't add up to more than 100%. So something has to be smaller, and the obvious thing is manufacturing. And that's sort of why we are in this position, is we're not particularly good at manufacturing. If we want to have a big manufacturing sector because somehow we feel there's something more inherently noble about making something you can drop on your foot than about providing services or digging up rocks or growing food and fibre. If we want a big manufacturing sector, even though it doesn't make economic sense, then we have to pay for it. Right? We paid for it between 1910 and 1989 by forcing us to pay a lot more for badly made cars, badly made clothes, badly made fridges. And as soon as Australians were given the chance to express a preference about that, so you can actually buy a Toyota rather than a Holden or a Ford, guess what they went for? So again, it's a bit like other types of government services. If you want them, you have to pay for them.
Yeah.
And so I don't, as I say, have any regrets about the fact that we don't have that sort of manufacturing capacity. What we need to do is to maintain friendly trade relations with other suppliers and maybe not become as dependent on a single supplier, China, as we did. It's not as if the Chinese are the only people in the world who make this sort of stuff. But having sensible trade policies and good relations with a range of countries to shore up supply lines. And after all, if we want people to buy our iron ore and our coal and our wheat and our wool and to come here for holidays and send their students to our universities, then we have to buy something from them, otherwise they can't afford to pay for it.
Yeah. We've touched on it a little bit, and it's not necessarily a modern invention, but there's an ancient concept in the Old Testament about a year of Jubilee, that after 7 sevenths of years, at the 50th year, there would be a general, probably restoration of the birthright, you might say, of people, the things that they had lost through indebtedness or other people taking their birthright in one way or the other, they'd have restored. And so I suppose there's some fairly ancient wisdom that sometimes the modern world tries to approximate through revolution or other things to kind of, move the gap between the disparity between those who have the greatest wealth and those who have the least wealth, and that probably it's arguable that gap's growing in Australia, and you'll be able to tell us about that. But just we touched on some of these questions which do concern probably people like us about what we think is normative and our aspiration about being able to, especially amongst the middle classes, transfer wealth onto a successive generation. The Shorten opposition at the last federal election did campaign on some tax reform around that area. Clearly was electorally not acceptable and didn't gain a lot of support. Do you think we're at a point to have a conversation around that? Go to you first, Kasy.
I'm going to be really controversial there then and take that conversation away from franking credits, because I never understood franking credits either. And when I say either, I don't mean that neither of you two do. I mean that I think a lot of the electorate didn't. But I'm going to think about the family home and its place in paying for aged care. And how we're going to afford aged care. If we talk about our economy the way we have talked about it, then aged care is unaffordable. It's quite simple. The Royal Commission's just come out 2 weeks ago or 1 week ago now. It's completely unaffordable to do it the way we do it. And those of us that do it and provide aged care would say that we're not doing it well enough. So we actually want to do it better, which is going to cost more rather than less. And so how do we deal with that? Well, the family home has to really be on the agenda. We have to be thinking about, does that come in? Do we preserve that for the You know, that if you've got a good home in a good suburb in Melbourne, you're probably sitting on, I don't know, I'm not from Melbourne, but you're probably sitting on an average of around 1.3 million or something in a big house in a good suburb. Do you keep that and transfer that through inheritance to your children, and then society pays for the aged care? Or is that part of that levelling, part of that generational levelling? Now, that's a hugely controversial policy, and that's something that anybody with a long memory in Canberra, and when I say Canberra, I mean in the government, they sort of almost give you the cross and say, don't talk about 1997. You know, it almost brought the Howard government down talking about that. But I think that's one of those examples where we really do have to think about how we level it, or how we pay for things that people, I think, have a right to expect. I cannot stomach or understand why we think that just because someone has finished their economic participation as they've retired, that their life is worth less, or that their care is worth less. And yet clearly we do, because we actually pay aged care. You know, that the kind of money that the government puts into aged care pays for a minimum wage. So, you know, people are paid a minimum wage to care for very vulnerable people often, but also people who really are in a part of their life where they could get a heck of a lot more out of than, you know, we seem to have as a society, just to smooth their dying pillow. But to think that we pay people a minimum wage to sit with people while they die, for example, I just think it's unpalatable. So I think that's one of those controversial re-reckonings of the 50-year jubilee, or how we deal with that. And I think aged care is one of those conversations we have to have around how else we change an economy, how else we move money. And if we were to put more money into care, and if we were to increase the amount of care, we would have a recovery from this recession that was spread right across the country, and actually, you know, did perhaps more good than buying a few extra frigates. And I could certainly see, I would feel in my heart that would be a better way to spend that money.
And Saul, debt always asks questions of us. How do you think we need to answer the question about this one of debt and the long run of choices we might need to make about public economic policy?
Well, let me sort of answer that in three different ways. First, in response to the question you phrased at the beginning about jubilees. I'm certainly very sympathetic to the idea that rich country governments should forgive a lot of debt incurred by the most highly indebted poor countries, which has happened before. Part of the problem, of course, is that these countries keep running debt up again, and a lot of it has been run up by notoriously corrupt governments and ended up in dictators' Swiss bank accounts. But nonetheless, the people who are suffering from those high levels of debt, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's compounded by the fact that most of these countries aren't going to get access to the vaccine, including because of protectionism in Europe. You know, and it's kind of ironic that the Europeans in particular like to preach morality to the rest of the world, and yet when it comes to sharing access to the vaccine, they're being, you know, the meanest of all. But certainly in that respect, I think there is a moral case for rich country governments to forgive debts that third world countries, we don't use that phrase anymore, developing countries have run up. Within individual societies, history tells us that very high levels of debt are often erased by bouts of inflation. Yeah, historically, the debts which governments ran up during World War I and World War II were largely eaten away by inflation. And although I don't think that's going to happen in these circumstances for reasons that if this were an economics lecture theatre I'd go into, but I won't here, I don't think that's going to happen. In other societies, it's happened as a result of wartime destruction and so forth. So there are, or revolution. Again, hopefully that's not going to happen on this occasion. But to go to the third point, and the one which Kasy was touching on, there are instances that happened in France after de Gaulle briefly ran France, and then he came back again in 1957, but some of France's World War debts were financed by a one-off capital levy that de Gaulle, who was a conservative, imposed. And I suppose his argument was that an awful lot of French people had paid the ultimate sacrifice with their lives to defeat the Nazis, and those who'd managed to survive the war and had a bit of money could afford to make a contribution as well. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily relevant in these particular circumstances, but what probably is, and what probably is in the context of the issue Kasy was raising about aged care, is the balance we draw in Australia between the taxation of income on the one hand and the taxation of wealth on the other. Now, let me make this point, which I don't think is well appreciated in Australia, that we actually have a surprisingly progressive tax system when it comes to the treatment of income by comparison with other Western countries. And what I mean by that is, first of all, our top rate of tax is about in the middle of Western countries. So our top rate's effectively 47. There are 17 Western countries with a higher rate and 16 with a lower rate. We're about in the middle. It cuts in at a very low income. So 180,000 sounds like a lot of money, but it's actually only double the average wage. There are only 6 countries in the OECD where the top rate cuts in at a lower multiple of average earnings than it does in Australia. We have an extremely high tax-free threshold. In fact, there are, I think, 24 Western countries that don't have a tax-free threshold at all. So there's a lot of people in Australia on low incomes who don't pay any tax at all. Our GST is about half the rate of the 34 Western countries that do have a GST. We do not have flat rate payroll taxes paid by employees to finance Social Security that for example, in America, in addition to their income tax, Americans pay a flat rate of 6.75% on the first 110,000 of income, and that's called a Social Security tax. In Europe, most people and their employers pay taxes of anywhere between 10 and 25% on top of their income, but it's a flat rate tax. We don't have that. And we also have Kasy would say, and I'd sympathise, a very tightly targeted welfare system. So while there are holes in it at the bottom end, we don't tax people in order to pay pensions to millionaires. So our tax system is actually very progressive when it comes to the way it treats income. And I, for one, am not in favour of raising top rates of tax. I don't see that anyone who earns, say, a well-paid public servant who has PAYE tax deductions taken out of his or her wages every week, and he's paying 47% on the top rate, I don't think, and he's not using any tax avoidance strategies, I don't think that person should be asked to pay more tax. Where there are loopholes in our system are that there's a whole lot of income that comes in forms other than wages and salaries, capital gains, rent, dividends, business income funnel through trusts, most of which accrues to people who earn more than the top rate threshold, but they don't pay the top rate on it. That's a big problem. The other thing is that Australia's tax system, while it is progressive in the way that it treats income, is very regressive in the way that it treats wealth. Unlike most Western countries, we don't have estate duties. We were the first Western country who had them to abolish them. Only 7 other Western countries don't have estate duties. The US and the UK, which we like to compare ourselves with, both have them. And you can find lots of Americans who think death duties are a good idea, notwithstanding the fact that they have to pay a lot of them. Bill Gates thinks they're a good idea. Andrew Carnegie, who's dead now, but at the time, 100 years ago, was the richest man in the world, was a proponent of death duties. Lots of other people. You struggle to find anyone other than, and he's no relation, Mark Carnegie, Sir Rod's son. He thinks they're a good idea, but I don't know of any other rich person in Australia who does. We don't tax land very much. Every economist in the country thinks that state government should do what New South Wales is now talking about, which is abolish stamp duty on the purchase of land and replace it with a broadly based land tax from which the owner-occupied home is not exempt. And I certainly support that. And I've actually, some years ago, wrote a report for Tim Pallas, the Victorian Treasurer, which recommended precisely that, and it's presumably propping up a wobbly desk somewhere in the state treasury. But there is a lot more that we could do about that. And so, interestingly, while income in this country is unequally distributed, absolutely, it hasn't got more unequally distributed in the last 25 years, whereas in most other Western countries it has, because we have a progressive tax transfer system when it comes to income. On the other hand, wealth has become much more unequally distributed because we don't tax it at all, except really through municipal rates. And we ought to, in my view. And, I say to my kids, we're not going to leave you all our money. We're going to leave it to the dog's home or something, and they get outraged about that, of course. But, the point is that I don't think people do have an untramelled right. Maybe let me put it this way. Not so much that people don't have an untramelled right to pass on their assets to their children, but rather children don't have an untramelled right to inherit wealth if they've happened to choose their parents carefully, without sharing some of it with those who are less fortunate. And this, I'll finish here, goes back to the point you alluded to about what was said in 1997 when the then federal government proposed the idea of a bond for people who were capable of paying it to meet the capital costs associated with aged care. There was all this outrage about forcing grandma to sell the family home, as if somehow when grandma went into aged care she'd be coming out of it at a later point and want to go back into her family home. This was sort of confected outrage, supposedly on the part of people who were at a stage of their life when they needed to go into residential care. But the truth was it was greedy children wanting to get, greedy adult children, right, most of whom already owned their own home, wanting to get their hands on a tax-free asset. And nobody was prepared to call that out for what it is, what it was, what it still is. And more people need to be prepared to do that.
Well, I think there's a few things there that might energise some conversation.
A question for Kasy. The value of a person's home being used for aged care or dipping into that, you could probably include superannuation as well, I suppose. If the government spent more money on the quality of aged care and people were... you're reading these horror stories at the moment of people putting into aged care and basically the owners, proprietors of those businesses, literally ripping people off, price gouging, I suppose is another way of putting it. If those sort of factors were worked out and the government put more money into the quality of aged care, in other words, if people who were going into aged care homes knew that they had a better quality, would they be prepared to spend or sacrifice their home as equity into the future quality? Would that change people's attitudes if... I think a lot of people hang on to their family home as the backstop.
Yeah.
So, can you comment on that? I probably haven't expressed myself very well, but...
So we'll just take one more question in the middle there.
Dennis Trudel. Between 1946 and 1967, Australia was one of the richest countries in the world because of export. What is the panel's thoughts about export? Because you briefly mentioned it, but export for the nation seems to be that thing over there. We shouldn't be doing it. What are your thoughts?
So I'll jump in, thank you. And one of the things I did neglect to talk about earlier, and thank you for bringing up superannuation, is just that as well. And I was thinking about it when you were talking, Saul, about taxation and being quite progressive there. We must remember that superannuation, because it's attached to the workforce, so it's a workforce attachment model, the more you earn and the longer you earn it, the more you'll have in your retirement. So people who are unemployed or who do work in something like aged care themselves reach their retirement with very, very little in superannuation. So that's another factor in that wealth accumulation to retirement. But I think you're right. There's more at stake in aged care than the family home. I was being a bit controversial in response to the Archbishop's question about the Jubilee and the re-reckoning and things. But there certainly needs to be quite a degree of tightening in some of the accreditation standards, in all those kind of things. There needs to be this is my belief now, you can go away and read the pack that is this big that comes as the Royal Commission reports, but my belief is certainly that we need to be more upfront about aged care. I think my own view is that we need to see our older years as a really valuable time of life. That way we will then value older people and we will have conversations about aged care. We often find that it's something people don't want to talk about. It's somehow in hushed tones, and so it's not as out in the open as it should be. But certainly I think, yes, we need to get all the standards right, we need to get the accreditation right, we need to make it a very transparent system, we need to have people in and out of there, and I don't mean, because you're right, it is often a one-way journey when people go into residential care, but we need to have visitors in and out of those places, we need to have families in and out, it'd be great to have local school kids and all those kind of involvements. But I do think there's a huge gap between what, as Australians, we expect of an aged care system and what we're actually prepared to pay for, because the money that comes in for aged care is very, very little for what is expected of it. And yes, you can reap some profits if you're prepared to be quite mercenary and cut corners in terms of food and payments and use very low paid staff and very low qualified staff. Hopefully a lot of the recommendations of the Royal Commission are targeted at that. As providers of good aged care, Anglicare services are in a disadvantage in that they have to either charge more or make less, and sometimes that's the choice that people are choosing on. But I think you're right. I think there's a lot to be done to raise people's confidence in aged care that would then give families the confidence to say, okay, mum's not coming back to this house. She's somewhere that's really good now, but also even if she did leave there, a house in the suburbs with stairs or lots of rooms to clean isn't what's necessary, and then put that house back into the housing stock. But Saul's absolutely right. It wasn't about mum or dad who wanted the house. It was the baby boomers who want to get their hands on that asset as part of their inheritance.
My hunch is that the electorate probably would be prepared to pay a bit more tax if it was hypothecated or dedicated to aged care in the same way that they were for the increase in the Medicare levy for the disability.
The NDIS, yeah.
For the NDIS. And I mean, as I remember, astonishingly, not even Tony Abbott opposed that. And there wasn't much that Tony Abbott didn't oppose.
Yeah.
The guy never ran a yes case in his life, so even he didn't oppose that. Now, I mean, the question really is, while that might be politically doable, it still doesn't address the question which you correctly raised and which I alluded to, that actually maybe we ought to fund this less by way of increased taxes on income and more by different taxes, including on wealth. But my impression is that if people approve of the purpose for which a particular tax is levied, and they are satisfied that actually the money is going to be spent on that, then they're more willing to pay that tax than they are just an increase in general taxation that goes into some pot of money that they don't trust how it's going to be spent. On the question that was raised before, I apologise for doing this, but I'm going to have to question the historical premise that you said. That the period between the end of the Second World War, well, it really started at the end of the First World War, but from the period from the Second World War until the late 1980s was a period in which, particularly from 1945 to 1975, we thought we were doing okay. And in absolute terms we were, but relative to the rest of the world we were falling behind. As I said before, and I'll repeat it, at the time of Federation, Australia, New Zealand and Argentina were the richest countries in the world in terms of per capita income. And although we might say, thank goodness we didn't do as badly as Argentina did over the last 80 years, and we didn't do quite as bad as New Zealand did, because New Zealand was much more hurt by Britain's entry into what was then called the common market than we were by 1992 23rd in the world. And, Lee Kuan Yew had said we were in danger of becoming the poor white trash of Asia, and Paul Keating said we were in danger of becoming a banana republic. And part of the reason was, and this is where you're correct, is that we had lost competitiveness in exports. You know, we exported a bigger proportion of our national income in 1910 than we did by 1990. And part of the reason for that, to go back to what I said was before, was because we kidded ourselves we could be good at manufacturing, which we weren't. And we now export about 23% of our national income, which for a country that's as far away from everywhere else is actually quite a high proportion. Because as I said before, again, particularly when it comes to manufacturers, being close to bigger markets is actually part of what helps you be able to do it. And, you know, we can't change that. You know, even though we like to say to ourselves, well, aren't we close to Asia? The reality is that Beijing is closer to Berlin than it is to Brisbane. Shanghai is closer to Stockholm than it is to Sydney, and Mumbai is closer to Madrid than it is to Melbourne. You know? So Asia is closer to us than North America or Europe are, but North America and Europe are still mostly closer to Asia than we are, unless you're talking about, say, Indonesia, which we're obviously much closer to than most other countries. And so we could do better at some aspects of exports than we have. And we've obviously got some problems on tourism now. We're going to have some problems on international education because the Chinese are obviously going to tell their families lies about the safety of Australia as a place for their own political reasons. We're going to have some trouble with thermal coal because at some point, unless we decide to get out of that business ourselves, at a pace that we decide, our customers are going to decide they're just not going to take the stuff anymore, and it'll be much more abrupt transition. And if we don't take some more meaningful action on climate change, then other countries are now going to impose what they call carbon tariffs on our exports. So we're going to face some challenges with regard to exports. But you know, basically you succeed in exports by focusing on what you're good at. And in the last 30 or so years, we've done that much more successfully than we did for the previous 80 years. And as a result, we have gone from being, as I said, the 23rd or thereabouts richest country in the world in the early 90s, when we had, and I usually hate this analogy, our road to Damascus-like conversion. You know, the story about the guy on the road to Damascus had a perfectly good name, and then he changed it. You had to think about it, didn't you? But since that time, we've climbed back to being about the 12th to 15th richest nation in the world. And a lot of that's due to the increase in the price of iron ore and stuff like that. But by and large, you know, you can question, have we distributed the fruits of that growth as well as we could have? And I think the answer to that's no, or as fairly as we could have. But in terms of actually generating national income, you know, up until about 2015, when things started to go a bit sideways, we did pretty well over that period.
And I think that there's some thoughts about the impact of robotics and the digital disruption generally as it unfolds that suggests that the kind of notions of employment we have will also fall by the wayside, and that we've really got to start looking at employment alongside other things that actually contribute to human well-being. And so participation, you know, rather than just having, you know, we become content with a certain level of structural unemployment. Reserve Bank's tasked with engineering financial tools to get to those outcomes, but what sort of society we have and how we actually see everyone participating and flourishing could be could take us give a very different grid to put over some of the questions that we often ask, which, you know, when you get to it, and, you know, touching on my earlier comments about sort of self-motivation and the long religious tradition of you know, money being the source of all evil, and you know, often is that kind of hip pocket nerve that politicians feel they've got to touch to get an electoral response. This will harm your interests. You know, you will be better off under this policy. And there's something which has to transcend that, I think, to look at how does a human society continue into the future? How do all people, as much as they can participate and flourish, because we could be looking at big disruptions that could even be as big as the COVID year that might be unfolding almost hidden in plain sight in our midst.
I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because it's on my shopping list of things to make sure I talked about this morning, was participation in employment. And that whole idea that economic employment is the absolute holy grail and that nothing else is good. And even as we talk about different ways that we measure our well-being and our wealth and things, I keep coming back to thinking that we really do need to go back to that conversation about how we measure well-being and human flourishing. And certainly at the government level, there's no appetite for a conversation beyond an economic participation. So even small policies like whether volunteering is recognised as part of your mutual obligation for the meagre income support, those kind of things. But volunteering, caring for country, caring for relatives, art, creativity, all those other areas of human life that we sacrifice in a way and say, well, that's what you do after you've had your economic life, where you earn your money and you earn your superannuation, then you go and do that bit. But we don't value it in the same way, and I think we really do need to think about that.
I just wanted to raise the issue of climate change and also the comment that as a country we're very good at growing things. And many of the audience may be aware that in the Pacific, in particular, they are facing considerable challenges in terms of rising seas and loss of their livelihoods and cultures as a consequence. And this is also, over time, going to increasingly impact coastal communities around the world, including our own, increasingly. And one concept in the past which was considered at great length and investment put into it was in terms of desalination plants, in particular in Adelaide, where there's a very large one close to desert, where seawater could be converted to fresh water and taken into inland to grow things on a vast scale. And this would actually send a message to our region that we're concerned about them and not only just ourselves. And I'd also like to highlight the point that in terms of the Anglican Church, we have many connections with the Pacific. But it's not only just the Pacific, it's right across the Asia-Pacific region as well as globally. Thank you.
And just the next question there.
Just in relation to housing, I've always considered housing to be a human right, that everyone has the right to a safe household, whatever. I live in the out eastern suburbs, and over the last few months done a lot of walking, driving. The amount of houses that are now empty, for sale signs, lease signs going all over the place. At the moment, it appears that the fear of missing out is driving the prices to unbelievably, little tiny houses, $1 million, and they're about to fall down. But I would like to know what you think will happen maybe in 6 months towards the end of the year when, bearing in mind in March, end of March, JobKeeper, Job Seeker, all that disappears. The moratorium on mortgages, there's still apparently 100,000 a lot of them investment loans about to have to be repaid. Where do you think housing will be at, say, the end of the year? And should people who want to maybe buy something just wait?
I'm happy to have a bit of a go, and I'll perhaps take off one hat and declare another at least. I'm a board member of Greenpeace Australia Pacific, and so, deeply concerned about these, but I don't have particular expertise. I alluded to it earlier. I'm very disappointed that we haven't used COVID as a greater opportunity to rethink, and I become increasingly disappointed as I see how we are attempting to get back to that new normal. It seemed like it was a good opportunity to really rethink how we lived together and how we lived on this planet, and as Anglicans, how we did address, the challenge of caring for all creation. I do think that intergenerationally it's probably the biggest concern of equity. I think a lot of conversations about what we export and how we export and what we produce and how we measure life's well-being does come down to whether we count the environment in or whether we count it out, whether we use it or whether we live within it. But I don't have any exact answers for desalination. I do have a personal concern about desalination, same as lots of things around things like air conditioning to make more inhospitable environments livable for humans. This is a very personal view, but I do think that until we learn to live in more harmony with the earth, and that sounds very, kind of parent or motherhood, but until we respect that more, I think that increasing the numbers of people that can live in certain areas isn't helpful when we look at the overall balance across hundreds of thousands of years. So that would be my very sort of quick take on the environment question.
Would either of you like to add?
Yeah, let me kind of respond more specifically to the question that was asked first and say the problem with desalination plants, at least insofar as the currently known technologies are concerned, is that they're incredibly electricity intensive. And unless you're in Tasmania, that means burning lots of fossil fuels that contribute to climate change in order to turn seawater into fresh water, which may solve one environmental problem but contribute to another one. So until we find sufficient in quantity and reliability supplies of renewable energy, and let me say we in Tasmania are perfectly happy to sell you in mainland Australia more of our clean and green hydroelectricity, but you've got to pay a bit towards the cable and for the electricity in order to get it, but the offer's there. We'd like a football team in exchange, among other things. But until you get clean and green electricity in sufficient quantities to fire desalination plants, then as I say, I think that's kind of solving one environmental problem whilst creating another. On the question in the Pacific, I think you're absolutely right. That the Pacific is one of the areas of the world that is most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, although another one, importantly, is the big megacities of Southeast Asia, most of which, Jakarta, Bangkok, Ho Chi Minh City, many others, are in areas that are more vulnerable, or more people live that are vulnerable to rising sea levels than almost anywhere else. Kolkata, Chittagong in Bangladesh, places like that likewise. And of course these are our backyard. And in particular the Pacific is our backyard, we're sort of morally and in other ways responsible for, along with New Zealand, for the well-being of the people in those countries. We're doing such a bad job of it, partly because we've been very austere with foreign aid. Under governments of both political persuasions have seen votes in cutting back foreign aid, rather than challenging the widespread perception that we spend 50 times as much on foreign aid as we actually do. Again, rather than calling out ignorance for what it is, they've kind of bowed to it, because that's what the focus groups tell the politicians they ought to do. But also our lack of leadership on climate change is costing us a lot of our moral standing in the Pacific, and the Chinese are exploiting that in ways that, the Chinese are making a significant contribution to global warming as well, but because they're pretending to do things about it, and they are actually doing some things about it while also contributing to it, they're sort of building up moral capital in the Pacific and using that to get bases which they can use to threaten us in other ways. So, there's a whole lot of reasons for doing in that space what the questioner said. Now, you're just going to have to remind me about the second one.
So
Sorry, my
the
apologies.
next question will be the last question. Our time has unfortunately come to an end, but the question was, what will happen in 6 months
yes,
to
about
the
housing.
market when
Sorry.
job seeker ends?
Yeah. So I don't want to give forecasts about house prices or what people should do. I'm not a licensed investment advisor. I think the ending of the mortgage and small business loan interest deferral payments will go quite smoothly, because already the proportion of mortgages that are subject to those arrangements, which peaked at about 11% in July last year, is now down to less than 2%. And the proportion of small business loans on which interest is being deferred, which peaked at 18% in July or August last year, is now down to about 1 point something. So that is being handled reasonably well. In the case of JobKeeper, we've already seen 2 step downs in both the levels of payment and in employers' eligibility for JobKeeper at the beginning of October and again at the beginning of January. And there's been no discernible impact on employment from those at all. So while I don't kid myself there'll be no consequences from the end of JobKeeper at the end of this month, I don't think the consequences will be as bad as had been widely feared. And you just look at the way that the unemployment rate has come down already. You know, in July, August last year, the Treasurer and others, the Reserve Bank, were forecasting the unemployment rate would get up to 10 point something and take a long time to come down. And here we are when it's officially 5.8. And, you know, that's only half a percentage point above where it was before the pandemic struck. There aren't now, as there were, any people who dropped out of the workforce because they didn't think they would be able to find a job and hence weren't counted as unemployed. All of them have come back. There are still about 160,000 people who are counted as employed even though they're not working any hours. If you add them back in, the unemployment rate effectively is 7.1%. That's too high. You know, the Reserve Bank wants to get it down to 4 point something or lower. That's good. They didn't pay enough attention to that before the pandemic. But I don't think that's a major concern. On the other hand, to go to the other part of your question, however, we have got housing policy wrong in this country since the mid-1960s. Right? If you think that between the end of the Second World War and the mid-60s to early 70s, our population was growing at a much faster rate, percentage-wise, than it has done in the last 20 years. And not only was our overall population growing at a faster rate, but we were also having a much bigger, proportionately, migration into our big capital cities from regional areas than we have had, even though that's been going on as well in the last 20. And yet, despite that, the home ownership rate in Australia went from about 47% at the census in 1947 to a peak of 72% in 1966. Without house prices changing as a multiple of income at all. It was about 3. The average house cost about 3 times the average wage, and people could buy a house on 1 income rather than needing 2, as is the case now. And the reason for that is that government's focused on increasing the supply of housing. Either by building lots of houses themselves, and admittedly lots of them were badly built and in the wrong places. That's why we've got Broadmeadows and other sort of areas of concentrated disadvantage, but they built lots of houses or encouraged the private sector to build lots of houses, and they didn't inflate demand. But ever since John Howard, when he was New South Wales President of the Young Liberals in 1963, managed to convince Bob Menzies to introduce the First Home Owners Grant. From about 1965 onwards, government policy shifted away from increasing the supply of housing towards inflating the demand for housing. By giving cash to people who bought first homes, or although at least to be fair to Menzies, there were restrictions on your income and the price of house you could buy. And then in the 70s and 80s, state governments basically stopped building public housing, and government shifted over at the federal level to ever bigger cash grants, negative gearing, the reduction in the capital gains tax, and now all housing policy is about inflating the demand for it. And so as a result, we've got more expensive housing. And because 11 million Australians own at least one property, 2.5 million own more than one property, that's enormously electorally appealing, because in any given year, there are only about 100,000 people who succeed in becoming a home buyer for the first time. Up until the point at which they become a first home owner, they want governments to stop doing things that put house prices up. Most of the people who will never own their own home live in safe Labor electorates. So neither the Labor Party nor the Liberal Party cares about them at all, because their votes are not winnable. They're not contestable. So neither party cares very much about people who will never own their own home. The people who do want governments, whose votes count, and who do want governments to stop putting there's only 100,000 of them in any given year, and as soon as they buy a home, then their view flips over. And then there are 11 million people who want governments to keep house prices going up because they think it makes them wealthier. 11 million who want higher house prices, 100,000 who don't. Even the dumbest of our politicians can do that math, as the Americans say, and that's what they do. So, we have this huge problem that for 40 years, housing policy has been doing the wrong thing, but at the same time, an overwhelming majority of Australians approve of it. One of the consequences of that is that the home ownership rate, which peaked at 72% in 1966, was at the 2016 census lower than it had been at any time since 1954. My guess is that when the 2021 census results come out sometime next year, they'll show it's the lowest since 1947. But no one is prepared to advocate for changes that will alter that. And the Labor Party went to the last 2 elections promising to do things about negative gearing. People say that it didn't hurt them in 2016 because no one thought they'd win. It hurt them in 2019 because everyone thought they would win, and so they paid attention to it. I think it's a great pity that the Labor Party has walked away from those policies, but my guess is that because of the 2019 election, no one is going to touch it for a long period of time, which I think is a pity. But until we are prepared to actually say to ourselves, is continually rising house prices such a good thing? Until we're prepared to A, ask the question, and B, answer it truthfully, nothing's going to change.
I'll be really, really quick. I'm not going to go anywhere near house prices, but I agree with the start of that question, which is that housing is a human right. If you don't have housing, getting your education, keeping your health, participating through any way, whether it's economic or non-economic, is pretty much impossible. It's also very hard to feel any worth if you're not housed, and it's also just difficult on basic physical survival on a day like today. I walked 120 metres to get here from my hotel, and I lost count of the number of people I saw asleep on the street, which is just absolutely shameful. And I think the thing that we have to have is the conversation that goes that things like negative gearing, capital gains tax, and other housing policies are not housing policies, they're wealth increasing policies. And I think when we have it that way around, that might be a little bit easier for us to talk about housing, but I'm not going near housing prices.
The trouble is, when you say they're wealth increasing policies, that means lots of people are going to vote for them.
Exactly, yes.
And that's the problem.
Yeah. And there's another conversation about whether democracy is the most equitable political system.
And thanks everyone for coming. It's really great after the long pause we've had just to get back to some of the engagement and try and look at in one way, what sounds like a pretty simple thing, but to try and tease it out, there's much more we could have said, and I hope you've got some more questions that you take out of here that you might be able to attend to, because I think this is really about our responsible participation as members of society, our responsible citizenship, and knowing what are some of those big questions that we need to ask, and in the long tradition of faith, to understand how we get a right balance between our own concerns, what's kind of good for our flourishing, but also the bigger picture, what's good for the flourishing of more people. So I'm really grateful for Kasy and Saul, who hasn't yet had his Damascus Road name change to Paul, but we'll... would you like to appreciate them, please, and I'll pray. Loving God, we thank you for the wisdom of those who have content knowledge and depth of understanding. We thank you for all of the aspirations that we've heard expressed today, aspirations for a society where people flourish, where the value of each is enhanced and their dignity grows by the way that policies allow their participation in our society. And we pray for us each as we reflect on these things, that we might be prepared to face some of those big challenges that sit there in the questions of political life and the economic life of our society. So we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.